Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, the show where we discuss important financial topics that were never covered in med school. I'm your host, Dr. Tarang Patel. Okay, let's just jump right back into part 2 of my discussion about private equity and medicine with Kurt Schoppe, a radiologist in Dallas, Texas. So, I think it's going to be a very interesting next few years. Now, in terms of what happens to these deals, one of the things that I don't think has been discussed very well in the literature or the journals of our various societies is what happens on the counter. I mean, okay, so physicians are being, their practices are being purchased by private equity, but there's another dynamic to that relationship, which is the patient, obviously, but also the healthcare systems that they work with. What do you? And there was an article, I think, recently in one of the local Charlotte. There was an anesthesia group in Charlotte that was bought up.
That's the example I was going to talk about.
Yeah. So I was like, what do you think? What are the hospitals' response to this kind of deal activity?
And that's a good question. And that's you have to remember for a lot of these groups. So if it's a private group, it's not owned by a hospital, they have the contract to provide services to that hospital. That hospital doesn't have to give them that contract. And with some of these specialties, there are other groups that the hospital can go to provide these services. And so the market in that way, while the market for patients is inefficient, the market for physician services is a little more efficient, and there's other options that the hospitals have. And so an example would be some of our own hospitals. My group specifically has 3 new contracts in the last year that hospitals have taken away from corporate or private equity owned groups and provided them to us because they didn't like working with that corporate or privately owned or private equity group, partially because those groups tend to be big, throw their weight around, and they aren't responsive to what the hospitals need. So the hospitals have that power, and the important thing is they have those options. Now, if you're in a market where there's no other options, then fine, you've got the hospital trapped. But that's why, just because you're a private equity based, say, radiology firm with 400 plus radiologists, the problem is you're spread all over the country. It's really local market dominance that matters more than anything else for healthcare. And it's very, very locale specific on how your size leverage works. So taking over the physicians in one single area will return more for you than taking over many physicians and a small number of physicians in many different places. So, but from the hospital standpoint, one of the issues they had, and this was specific to the Charlotte instance, is so you had an anesthesiology group owned by a private equity group, and what the hospital was charging was that they were not responsive to the hospital's needs, and they did not like the way that the group was managing the patient care, and they took exception to that. And so they looked at finding another group to provide those services. The problem is the physicians didn't change. The physicians had been working there, and other physicians were happy with those physician services. But if the hospital doesn't like working with whoever is running your administrative team, which if you're owned by a corporate or a private equity firm, those people are going to be running your administrative teams. It doesn't matter how nice your physicians are if they don't like the way that the group is being managed and they're not paying attention to what the hospital wants. And so you got to keep in mind, we don't like applying the client label to patients. And in some ways, they aren't necessarily our clients because it's not a market-based economy. The patients are a little bit trapped. But who is our client is hospitals or other facilities at which we provide our service. And so some of these large groups haven't been responsive to their hospitals, or on the other side, they overpromise and underdeliver. When they promise lots of efficiencies and data and other things, and the hospitals don't realize those, and they realize the trade-offs that they have with them and the lack of control the hospitals or leverage the hospitals have over those groups, the hospitals start looking more for the physicians again.
Yeah, it's a lot of variability, a lot of different dynamics at play, and it's going to be so it's going to accelerate, like you were saying, because right now there's a lot of these deals that have, in certain markets. Phoenix, I'm in Phoenix. That big number of deals have happened here recently. In radiology, Houston is a big market for that, but it's interesting. I think you're right. We're just kind of at the initial points of this, and we're going to start seeing more and more of this. And so the question is to the obviously, I can see from the older, more established physicians why you would want to do this, because it gives you the lump sum payout and a guaranteed structure for the next 4 or 5 years while you're basically planning your exit point. But as we go to the younger physicians, I hope that they are becoming more and more aware of this, and sometimes that may be the situation where they have to practice, but hopefully they start analyzing their employment prospects a little bit more critically than physicians in the past have, and they haven't really had to do that as much previously.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the problem is it's just one more bit of information and stuff that you're not familiar with, and now you have to familiarize yourself with. And that's why so many of these deals, while some of us that are early or mid-career but already in the game, we see these as negatives because they take away some of our upside, they take away some of the work, they present you with a different master. I prefer to be one that runs my own business, not one that is working for somebody who is unaccountable to me, in a sense. But for trainees that are coming out, that's why they're critical to this model, because in essence, the way that they're viewed by their owners at that point is they're much cheaper labor. They don't know anything different. And they're a revenue opportunity. Your multiples, your revenues go up every time you hire one of the new ones into a different compensation model than an existing radiologist or anesthesiologist or whomever. And that's what's happened with some of those anesthesia groups, because not so much in radiology, but in anesthesia and emergency medicine, you've had more of these deals go for what we call like the full cycle, as in purchase, consolidation, packaging / quote unquote improvement, and then resell. And there's a few radiology groups that have gone through. More likely, it's when their corporate owner was consolidated or bought by another corporate owner. That's your Amsur, Sheridan, now Mednax deal, where they've had 3 different compensation models, 3 different benefits packages, and their ownership has changed 3 times. Most of them would argue for no improvement or some decrement. And that's one of the things we haven't really talked about with this is incentives. And when you own your own business, you decide how much you work and what's important to you. When somebody else owns your business, they decide how much you work and what's important to them. And a lot of times what these deals are going to be is you need to generate revenue. So that usually ends up meaning working harder, faster, longer, and making compromises. Whereas if you own yourself, you can decide how much money you make. You can decide what your priorities are and shape them that way. And I don't come at it from a standpoint of one's evil, one's good. There's plenty of people in private practice who have made bad decisions and done things for the wrong reasons. So I don't like to look at it from that standpoint. But in this age where we're talking about burnout and physician satisfaction and who is a good physician, we have data that shows that physicians who operate at a higher quality level tend to have less burnout. And things that lead to burnout are feelings of helplessness, feelings of being a cog in the wheel, as it were, which is why I use that there. When you get to decide how you practice, you can prioritize what's important for you. If somebody else owns you, they get to prioritize what's important for you. And that can lead to a lot of stress, which makes you a worse physician.
And, this is, getting it back a little bit to the trainee thing. Again, we're being a radiologist, you're a radiologist, we're talking about a lot of the deal flow that's been happening in these fields, but we're at this point right now where the radiology job market is actually really good in terms of number of jobs compared to 3-4 years ago. Trainees are reporting that that they have more offers now than they did earlier, either at the end of residency or in fellowship, than they did just a few years ago. But a lot of them are these jobs for corporate practices. And so how do you think that'll impact the success or failure, or if it impacts either direction of this private equity movement?
The trainees as an option, they're important for this business model to work because of the relative bonus that the owning provider gets out of their lower compensation. But That's why you see a lot of these companies spending a lot of times advertising to legitimize themselves to the level of the trainees. So specific to radiology, you see these groups putting certain members up, certain groups, and others at big radiology conferences. And what happens is you see their slide backgrounds and their names up at these places with their fancy booths and a few podium presentations and like a plenary session here or there, because they're putting a lot of money towards those radiology conferences to get that exposure, because what it does is legitimizes them in the eyes of the trainees as the future of medicine, or we're the new thing and we're going to make it so much better. And they might, and I'm fine with that. That's okay. They might do it. The problem is, step back and ask why they're doing it. The physicians in some of those groups are perfectly honorable individuals. I don't ascribe any malice necessarily to their intent, and they are probably truly working at making the practice better. A lot of us are, including us in private practice. We put a fair amount of investment into our quality program. I spent 3 hours this morning at a quality meeting that I run. We don't spend a lot of time advertising it, but when you take one step away from that level of the physicians doing that work to the corporate or private equity ownership level, it's a revenue play, and you're investing in future revenues. And so there's a reason that they're doing it that way. And then when you look at some of the job offers, and this comes with having the eye or experience that the trainees don't have, is the way that some of these offers are phrased. And when somebody interviews for them and then comes and interviews for us, and then you lay out what total compensation is, including benefits, bonuses, and others, and you can compare them directly to what the offers that they have published or gone through, you start to see very stark differences, and you see where they're making their play for the trainees and why they're doing it that way. And so, I come from a group that doesn't have a big buy-in. We don't own technical or imaging centers, so it's a professional fee only group. So there's not some huge buy-in that any trainee is going to have to come in. And honestly, they start very close to what a partner is going to make. And within 3 years, everybody's paid the same. There is no senior partnership. Our group's very flat in the compensation model, and you ramp up very quickly. But you can see where the delta is on some of these offers. And the trainees just don't have the sophistication to sit there and compare. And the other thing that you mentioned earlier is we tend to have a lack of transparency on what physicians are paid and how. And so it's very hard to compare these offers unless you're sitting there with two simultaneous ones. And that number of people and the time period of which you have those to compare is small and short.
I think that's something, and I'm glad you came on this podcast, and I'm glad there's a lot of other people now kind of working to improve that transparency, because a lot of times we spend more time analyzing, purchasing a car than we do these kind of offers in terms of the critical eye. And even though, because we just don't have the background or the information to do it. So I would encourage those who are in residency or very early in their career to reach out to, mentors or more established physicians in different fields in their field, and really try to understand what their options are, because it's not something that I think physicians as a profession do very well in an organized fashion. But it's really done informally, and that's fine. But we leave a lot of people kind of out of the loop then when that happens. And then that's similar things can be ascribed to gender gap and salary and things like that too. So I really do think that it's critical that doctors become more aware of their options, and just spend a little bit more time trying to learn this thing, because and ultimately whatever decision you make, whoever you choose to work for, just as long as you're more aware of what's out there, you'll make better informed decisions.
Oh yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's just like, I don't necessarily hold it against somebody if they smoke. I prefer they not smoke where I have to smoke with them. But if they understand the risks and they choose to do it, that's fine. I don't hold anything against anybody who works for one of the private equity owned groups or a corporate owned practice. Sometimes you need to be in a geographic area. They're the only option. Sometimes that's the best option for you. I would prefer that you had the full plate of information to make the decision. And while I tend to not think that it's the best model for physician practice, that doesn't make me right. It's just my opinion. Right. But what I don't want is you to get taken advantage of because of information arbitrage. And some of the private practice groups are part of the problem here, in that they're in their general lack of transparency. And so therefore people tend to have a measure of distrust. for those groups because they don't necessarily understand. Then you get into just straight up misinformation. And it's specific to our specialty. There are certain websites that have forums that you're allowed to post anonymously on, and people share information. Just because somebody says something online, we should have all learned enough from Twitter to know that anonymous accounts lead to a lot of trash talking without not a lot of truth to back it up, or people intentionally labeling certain groups, certain places as negative for their own personal reasons or to gain an advantage. And so one of the reasons that is so stressful for trainees or other people to evaluate some of these groups, these types of business models, or the compensation packages is just not only is the information hard to get to, verifying that it's accurate or dealing with the sheer volume of trash information that's out there and the lack of trust that you can have in the information once you get it. And so, as a specialty, and I can speak specifically for radiology here, not the other specialties, but imagine it's similar. You can't necessarily trust the forums. You really can only trust people you know. And this comes back to talk to people from your residency or fellowship programs who have gone out in the last couple of years. When you're a first or second year, you may not know the upper levels in your training program very well, but do your best to establish at least their non-work, non-academic associated email addresses so you can get a hold of them later. And actually, they're probably one of your best sources of information on groups, compensation, practice models, and the rest. And that scales across any specialty really, but particularly for radiology.
Great. That's really good advice. I think that's absolutely true. And I mean, we've, informally done that for a long time, but it is something that, we should definitely continue to encourage. And it's always good for job contacts and references and things like that for the long run. So I don't want to spend too much more time belaboring this, but I do want to kind of talk a little bit about this. But what do you think? So where do you see this going in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of the deals? And again, this is just your opinion. We understand. So
yeah. And as a white coat investor says, is my crystal ball is just as cloudy as other people. But if the way this is panning out is most of these groups are seeing their consolidations, you're starting to see some pushback around the edges, like the Charlotte anesthesiology problem, some of the Chicago radiology groups, and others. And so what really the things that are going to change, and then we'll see what the response is, because it's just like markets. Markets don't move because an asset price changed. Markets move because people's reaction to an asset price change moves the market. And so what you're really looking at is not just how these private equity or corporate places do deals or consolidate physician practices. You're looking for people's reaction to that process and what they're going to do with it. And so you're starting to see some pushback around the edges. What really gets down to it is I think you might have reached a bit of a detente as far as dynamics, unless something else really big happens, and then everybody's going to respond to it. So things like that hedge fund short selling one of the publicly traded companies that consolidates physician practices. If that company starts missing earnings statements or has a significant negative outcome, this could all turn against corporate ownership of physicians. If Medicare changes their regulations in a way that makes it very difficult for them to operate, it could turn against the consolidation of physician practices. If public opinion gets to where people are paying attention to this, and I'll draw people's attention or your listeners' attention to an article, I can't remember which post it was in, but it was about corporate and private equity ownership of veterinary practices and how it changed those physicians, those veterinarians' practice of medicine and how they charged their clients, the pet owners. It was very revealing. There's not a lot of difference between the way some of these corporates or private equities operate and those financial firms that were owning the vet practices. They have to generate revenue. It's going to change the way physicians practice. If you have a bad outcome or a media case or other people start pushing back, it could turn against it. Now, those are all the negatives. Some of the ways that this could speed up is Medicare makes rapid changes, and one of the only ways that people see that they can deal with changing healthcare reimbursements is by consolidating. These people are the best choices for consolidation, whether private equity or corporate. Hospital systems see it in their best interest to partner on a large scale. Hospital systems or insurance companies see it in their best interest to partner on a large scale with large physician groups to realize efficiencies and for somebody to make more money. That's going to accelerate the consolidation of physician practices. If people see it as a viable option to work against single payer healthcare, to be able to get big and have better negotiating, depending on how Medicare would administer that program, you will see an acceleration in consolidation. So this could really go both ways. And I see it not so much as the financial returns. I think we've reached a little bit more of a steady state. It's if something on the playing field changes and people's sentiment towards it shifts. If it shifts negatively, I think they're going to have a hard time. If it shifts positively, you just have an acceleration in the practice. If the one thing I would prefer to happen is that we have increased moves towards price transparency and a separation of health insurance companies from employers, to where physicians are able to work more directly with their own patients in a way. I think that moves towards price transparency and will affect the prices for healthcare services more than some of these other options. Ideally, that they would be much, much lower. And for those prices to be much, much lower, a lot of the regulation and administrative fat has to be cut out of that system. And so I would tend to prefer us to get more towards a direct physician-patient relationship and get some of these other people out of the middle. And I'm happy to get paid a lot less to do that, to get some of this other stuff out, because I think it just gums up the works.
Well, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot of information. So I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but it's been really useful. Any resources that you would suggest to people if they wanted to learn more about it? The article you mentioned, we'll put a link.
There's some groups, and the American College of Radiology specifically is putting together kind of a market analysis of these firms. That American College of Radiology is going to take a neutral position on it because they serve all of radiology, not one or the other. So there will be no picking sides, but their goal is to help people understand it, to be able to make those choices. And so I know that there's going to be some information about that probably coming in early 2019 as like a white paper, is how they usually publish these things. Just know it's hard to find information on these. And so direct information is your best bet. And that's if you have friends, colleagues, or prior co-residents or co-fellows who are in different of these work environments, is to get a hold of them. And I have a lot of people. I trained at Wake Forest. A lot of my prior co-residents, or even people there now, just through the Wake Forest connection, will email me and we'll talk. And I try to just give them a heads up in as neutral way as I can, which is why I usually start with my opinion on it to help them evaluate what works for them. And I don't know that there's a lot of publicly available information that you can actually deep dive into it, unless you're just looking at some of the business literature for how these deals are structured and more technical language.
Well, Dr. Schoppe, thank you for appearing on the podcast and giving us a lot to think about. I want to thank Dr. Schoppe for being my guest on the podcast. I think his discussion was a very balanced and educational approach to understanding what private equity is and why they are interested in healthcare. Obviously, their job is to make money, and healthcare is just the latest realm in which they're entering to achieve predictable rates of return for their investors. But make no mistake about it, their number one client are their investors. I actually reached out to a private equity firm that's involved in radiology deals to appear on the podcast and give me their version of why they're looking at these deals. But they declined, and that's okay. I suspect that they don't want to reach out to the physicians and would rather reach out to media in which investors are involved and educate them, because most physicians who are not part of the private equity deals probably have a somewhat critical or suspicious eye towards these deals. And for you, the younger listener, the ones who are in training right now or just out of training, you have a long career arc ahead of you. And the question is to you, would you limit your upside in order to gain predictable revenue? I wouldn't personally, but I also haven't received a lump sum payout. And I know that many physicians who have obviously would have different answers as to what their choices are. So, like I say, it is a deal. Whether it's a good deal or a bad deal for long-term in medicine, you have to analyze what it means to you and your practice and your field. But the article that came out that I referenced earlier in the introduction of episode 41 about the redaction of a paper in a dermatology journal under pressure from some of these private equity firms in dermatology should be a cautionary signal as to the further erosion of physician independence in healthcare. And as a physician, healthcare professional, even as a patient, that should be very concerning. You are being censored, potentially being censored by business entities that are not interested specifically in patient outcomes. So anyway, I encourage you to discuss this further with your colleagues. Please share the podcast with other members of your profession, and let's continue this discussion on the Dr. Money Matters Facebook group. So if you're not a member yet, please join. It's open to physicians and other healthcare professionals. But I would like to discuss this this topic because it's happening everywhere. And while we're still at a very small percentage of practices that have been purchased, I see articles and deals that seem to be happening at least weekly in radiology, and I also have seen these in the other fields that we discussed: anesthesia, emergency medicine, ophthalmology, dermatology. So if it hasn't happened to your field, it's probably heading that way. So let's get your voice and let's see where you stand on these issues. Once again, thanks for listening to the Dr. Money Matters podcast. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Dr. Money Matters. If this is the first episode you have heard, I appreciate you taking the time out and listening, and encourage you to listen to our past episodes. I would also appreciate you leaving me a positive review on Apple Podcasts, and also recommend you join our Facebook group where we have ongoing discussions about this and other topics in order to help each other reach our financial goals. Finally, I encourage you to subscribe to our email list and also to subscribe to the podcast itself on the various podcast app that you use in order to be kept aware when the latest episode comes out. More episodes of this podcast are available at www.drmoneymatters.com and on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Audio versions are also available on YouTube and Facebook. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Money Matters or on Facebook or Instagram at Dr. Money Matters, all spelled out. Thanks for listening, and if you get a chance, please leave a positive review for this podcast as it helps move the podcast up the rankings on iTunes and gets it exposed to a wider audience. Thanks for listening once again, and stay tuned for another episode coming soon.